have a few questions tonight that we'll endeavour to answer. First question is, how do you know if your wish for results in the practice is craving? Craving is one of the words we translate, I used to translate the word Dhamma. So craving is three types of craving, three types of Dhamma. Craving for the objects of the senses, sight, sound, taste, smell, touch. Craving to have and to become. Craving not to have, not to become. And craving has avijja, ignorance, as its cause. And craving itself is a cause for clinging, upadana, and becoming, and ultimately birth, and then aging, sickness, suffering, physical suffering, mental suffering. So this is what we call mental defilement in the series of events that leads up to suffering. Craving plays a big part in that. So when we come to practice the Dhamma, obviously we have to have some motivation. Something has to be making us want to practice. But it's true, sometimes that wanting to practice becomes craving rather than something more pure coming from faith in the Buddha Dhamma Sangha or the teachings, and maybe some wisdom also that sees the nature of suffering, sees that life is bound up with suffering, even if it's not all suffering, there is suffering in life, and there's that wish coming from some insight, that the wish to be free from suffering, understanding that suffering is suffering, it's not good and it's not what we want and it's painful. There's the more wholesome wish to be free from suffering, which is called chanda, sometimes kusala chanda, wholesome desire, and leads us to practice. But these two qualities, that affect the mind or condition the mind, both wholesome desire and craving, they alternate. So sometimes it is hard to know the difference between the two or recognize the difference between the two. The craving tends to fix on its object. Thank you. So the question was about the difference between the wish for results in the practice, or knowing whether the wish for results in the practice is craving. And so craving always has suffering as a result, leads to suffering. It's part of the causal process leading to suffering. So that's where you can recognize craving sometimes. First of all, you notice you're suffering, you're stressed. Even when you're practicing Dhamma, you can get stressed by it. So it can be stressful when you're trying to keep precepts, be mindful, restrained, and craving can slip into the desire to keep precepts. And one of the sufferings that may arise is when you're angry with yourself if you're not mindful enough to keep a precept. You break a precept and then you get angry. Or judging others and looking at others, comparing with others and being, say, critical of others who don't keep precepts in the same way you do perhaps. Don't follow the rules. we start to lose track of why we keep precepts. And precepts are useful training rules to help change our behaviour for the better, and to stop us making bad karma. But when craving comes in, then even precepts can become a cause of suffering, because they're wrong. We grasp them wrongly and practice them with the wrong understanding. Or meditation is very common that we get craving slipping into our desire for results. So we've heard talks and read the books, and we want success in our meditation because we put effort in and we give it time and give it importance. So then as we're meditating, we may slip into the thought, I want samadhi, I want jhana, I want insight, I want to know things, I want to see things, or even I want nibbana, I want an end of suffering, can be fed, that desire can be fed by craving. And so it leads to disappointment. Different kinds of suffering arise because craving leads to suffering. So if you're not getting what you want, you become frustrated. So if somebody's practicing with too much craving, they often become disappointed, unhappy with their meditation, with what they're doing, and maybe even turn away from it or give up, or certainly sit there or walk, whether you're sitting or walking meditation, you're sitting or walking unhappy with what you're experiencing because you crave results so much that you're disappointed with what you're experiencing. Whereas when you have just basic desire, wholesome desire to practice because you understand that there is suffering in life and you want to get beyond the suffering, it leads you to the skillful action. So if you're meditating, leads you to put effort into bringing up mindfulness of your object, for example. So rather than thinking, when am I going to get samadhi, when am I going to get insight, you're putting your attention on the breath, for example, if that's your meditation object. Or you're being mindful of the perception of impermanence in physical and mental phenomena, sensations, thoughts, and so on. You're doing that rather than just sitting there thinking and wanting the results, the end of suffering, the jhanas and the nibbanas and the products of the practice. So, correct, wholesome intention, wholesome desire leads to skillful action. Craving leads to more mental agitation, discontent, suffering. So sometimes you learn after the event, you're already suffering, and then you reflect back, why am I suffering? I'm meditating here, aiming to get beyond suffering. Why am I increasing my suffering? Perhaps because your mind has been taken over or hijacked by craving as you meditate. Or if you're becoming peaceful, usually it's because you're letting go of craving and you're practicing what you intend to, bringing up mindfulness directed to a wholesome object, and continually doing that, you continually let go of craving, well, the mind feels better, more relaxed, more calm, body and mind become more calm. And that's a good basis for insight to arise. Even the practice of dana, generosity, can be done with craving. You want something in return for this sacrifice, this generosity you've practiced. You want people to like you and praise you, you want a good reputation, you want results in the future, in the sense you want a good rebirth because you've made all this dana, made all this merit, and so on. You get caught into wanting things, even practicing charity or generosity. Whereas if you practice it with right view and mindfulness, you're just doing it because you know it's a good thing to do and you're letting go of some attachment. And you're not seeking anything in return. So another telltale sign that craving is creeping into your thinking is a sense of, we say, sense of self. So you're meditating with a sense of self. I am meditating and I am not satisfied with the results I'm not getting. Or even can be on a more subtle level. I am satisfied and I'm very good, and conceit and craving arise, and we attach. Craving leads to attachment, so we cling and attach to the results of our meditation and feel we're somebody special, or we know a lot, or we're enlightened. You can fool yourself into thinking you're enlightened because of craving. So all of this has to be investigated. Ajahn Chah used to give the teaching that craving in its nature is impermanent. So use that reflection to help deal with craving well. So it's not sure. The craving comes up in your mind. I want peace. I want samadhi. I want nibbana. It's not sure. It's just a thought. It's just a craving that arises, passes away, and you see that impermanent nature of craving. You let go, and then the mind actually genuinely becomes peaceful when you let go of craving. But when you follow craving, the mind becomes more agitated, more frustrated. In Thailand, they say it becomes hotter. Your mind heats up with craving. When you let go of craving, let go of the sense of self, the attachment, your mind cools down. And when you're practicing, say particularly in meditation, when you do abandon craving, you have this sense of contentment, satisfaction, the sense of self disappears. So you don't even feel like there's a person meditating. There's just the skillful action of putting attention on the breath, becoming mindful, absorbing into the breath, and the mind becomes still. And the craving and attachment and the sense of self disappears. So the results are different. When there's craving there, you get one set of results. When there's no craving there, or when you're abandoning craving, you get a different set of results. This is one way you can learn from your practice. Another question: what is the difference between inappropriate attention, ayoniso manasikara, and a wrongly directed mind, micca panihita citta? Looks like someone's studying the Abhidhamma perhaps, getting quite technical here, and you can get as technical as you want in the Abhidhamma. Some people like that. It's the same as reading the technical manuals for computers or car engines and things. It can be quite fascinating. You get into it with the terms and the relationships between different terms and objects and things. It's a long time since I studied the Abhidhamma. Inappropriate attention, sometimes we say unwise attention. So paying attention to an object which feeds craving and attachment, feeds mental defilement, greed, anger, delusion. So unwise attention or inappropriate attention, you see some nice food that you really like, the perception of liking and desire, craving comes up because you keep looking. If you turn away, you no longer are giving unskillful, unwise attention to that food. Well, you might just forget about it, or the craving fades. You're not feeding the craving at that time. Or if something makes you angry, if you keep thinking about it with unwise attention, you keep attending to the object of your anger, well, you'll continue to be angry and continue to suffer. So it's a kind of, implies an ongoing action, isn't it? Unwise attention. You keep thinking of, you keep directing your mind to be aware of a certain thought, a certain perception, a certain experience. So when you're meditating, if you have pain in your leg, unwise attention, which is not supported by mindfulness, wisdom and many other qualities. Unwise attention is just looking at the painful nature or becoming aware of the painful nature of that feeling in your leg, and then you tend to go to negativity. So your mind just complains or becomes irritated or angry based on that feeling. You're not giving it wise attention. You may, if you train yourself, you may just note, painful feeling arises as you're meditating. You just note it, and then you let it go. You say, oh yeah, painful feeling, I know that. And you move on. You don't dwell on it with ayoniso manasikara. Ayoniso manasikara leads to, it feeds your ignorance, it feeds the hindrances that block samadhi arising, it feeds ignorance. You become less wise, more attached, and suffer more for it. We say it doesn't make you clever, it makes you foolish. A wrongly directed mind, micca panihita citta, slightly more technical, so I apologize if I don't give the proper answer here, but in Thai we say the wrongly directed mind, we say the wrongly established mind. So again, it's established in unwholesome dhammas that will ripen in suffering of one sort or another. So it's not directed correctly, it's not set up correctly. It's like, you have a computer, you don't set it up correctly, it doesn't work. It doesn't give you the information and let you do the things you want to do because you haven't set it up correctly. If you don't set your mind up correctly with Dhamma, with the factors of the path, with wholesome, skillful Dhammas, it doesn't bring you happiness, doesn't bring you the results of the practice that you're seeking, doesn't bring you liberation from the defilements, doesn't bring you nibbana. May bring you rebirth in a lower realm. Strictly speaking, if you misdirect your mind, you're aiming for rebirth in a lower realm. That would be one description in Buddhism, because the karma we make doesn't just ripen in this life, it ripens in future lives as well. So if you misdirect your mind, you don't establish or direct your mind correctly, it means you're aiming for something that is suffering, because the Buddhist teachings are aiming to get you out of suffering. So you've misdirected your mind, you've gone the wrong way, you're thinking in the wrong way, you're intending your mind in the wrong direction, so it's going to lead to more suffering in this life. You're going to have more despair, more anguish, more sadness, more frustration, and then in the next life it will ripen in birth in the lower realms perhaps. If it becomes very strongly, a strong intention or strong series of intentions. So it's part of our practice with yoniso manasikara, wise reflection, and a well-established mind, so not micca but samma panihita citta. These two words, micca and samma, are opposites. So micca is wrong, samma is right or correct. Correct for the ending of suffering, micca wrong because it leads to suffering. Ayoniso manasikara, unwise attention. Yoniso manasikara, wise attention. It's just pointing out that you can use your mind to go in opposite directions, to cultivate the path leading to the end of suffering, or to lead to more suffering. What starts in the mind comes out in your speech, your actions. We make more karma. So if you get it wrong, you set up your mind wrong to start, then everything else will start to go wrong. And you won't be following the path to the end of suffering. You'll be following the path to suffering, which we do a lot of the time. So we have to practice mindfulness and come back and develop the skill in wise reflection and setting the mind up with wholesome, skillful qualities, and this will lead us out of suffering and also prevent suffering arising. Another question. What are the differences among asavas, fetters, hindrances and defilements? Well, the word mental defilements, kilesa, is kind of catch-all for all of these things, and there's more. You didn't mention the floods and the yogas and the four upadanas and there's a lot of description of defilement in the Buddhist texts. Often there's lists, interrelated qualities like craving and attachment, and then fetters. Fetters means literally fetters, sangyojana. There's 10 of them, and they fetter your mind to the round of samsara, birth and death, to suffering. So the first 3 are abandoned by the stream winner, so that's personality view, or self-view, sakkaya ditthi, skeptical doubt, vicikicca, attachment to external practices and rituals, silabbata paramasa, and then the once returner, the sakadagami, doesn't fully abandon the next 2 fetters, but they weaken them. That's attachment to sensuality and ill will. So they're weakened, but they're still there, the roots of them are still there in the mind. And then the next stage of enlightenment, the anagami, the once returner, the non-returner, has abandoned attachment to sensuality and ill will, attachment to the body, so their mind becomes very refined, and generally they've established samadhi on a very deep level, but they still have the subtle defilements of attachment to the bliss of the jhanas and the conceit and the conceit of self, and some very subtle restlessness of mind, and also ignorance. Only the arahant has completely abandoned all 10 fetters. So your practice, they sometimes say the practice is like harvesting rice. To harvest rice, you need to grab the rice plant, and then you need your knife and you cut it. Grabbing the rice plant is like the qualities of mindfulness and samadhi, making your mind firm and clear. The knife is wisdom. So wisdom is what cuts off the fetters. Wisdom is what cuts off the asavas. The asavas are translated as effluents, intoxicants, pollutants, outflows. So we tend to think of them as like when the sewage system overflows and you get sewage flooding out into the fields. It doesn't happen very often, but it can happen. So there's outflows of effluents. So obviously mental defilements are always described as something, dirty, smelly, not undesirable. Hindrances, well, they're more temporary, aren't they? Because you meditate to abandon the 5 hindrances, and when sati is strong and wisdom comes up, clears your mind of the 5 hindrances, you attain samadhi. One-pointedness, ekaggata, your mind is unwavering, it's still, it's firm. But of course, that won't necessarily last, and then Ajahn Chah used to say, samadhi is like a rock on grass. You take the rock off the grass regrows. While the rock is there, the grass doesn't grow. So while you abandon the hindrances, it seems like the kilesas, the mental defilements, have gone. You're peaceful, which is good, you get a rest, but then they're lurking in the background. They haven't been completely abandoned. Anusaya is another list of 7 defilements that are also defilements, and they're called like underlying tendencies. So even if you abandon the hindrances and attain some samadhi for a while, the underlying tendencies, they are weakened a little bit, but they're still there. So you come out of your samadhi and you can get angry again. If you're not mindful or the right conditions arise, you get anger or greed or lust or fear can arise again, even though you've come out of a deep state of samadhi. This is why we have to cultivate mindfulness in all postures and all activities, and investigate the Dhamma and develop vipassana insight into impermanence and the selfless nature of phenomena, and particularly coming out of samadhi you have to do that, because the grass starts to grow again, doesn't it? If you put a rock on grass, it goes all yellow and dies, and then you take the rock off, it doesn't take long and the grass springs up, doesn't it? And kilesas are like that. The hindrances return, the asavas are there, the fetters are there. If you're still unenlightened, then things start to happen again, so you have to be on your guard. But the Buddha described the mental defilements rooted in greed, anger and delusion in all these different lists. As I said, he also mentioned them as floods, or yogas is like yokes, as binds, things that bind the mind, sully or blemish the mind. And he's just looking at how suffering arises, describing that for us and giving us some different lists of dhammas that work together and divide up the defilements into their different characteristics. So similarly, as we develop the path, which also has its lists, lists like the 7 factors of enlightenment, the Noble Eightfold Path, the 5 powers, the 5 indriyas, 5 basis for success. There's many lists of wholesome dhammas as well. So we have lists of unwholesome dhammas and lists of wholesome dhammas. And some people find these very helpful to review what's going on in their mind and to learn little bit more and see the relationship or the links between different qualities. But don't worry too much if sometimes you forget the list. And Luang Pu used to joke about this sometimes and get the number wrong, the 6 factors of enlightenment or something like that. Whether he was doing it purposely to sort of tease people, because some people are very pedantic and attached to the Dhamma lists and the text and the theory, or he was genuinely forgetting. Either way, we have to remember that memory is impermanent, so sometimes these lists will fade from your mind. But keep developing the mindfulness, and this will help you to deal with defilements. Another one. The Pali Canon outlines the 18 ideas about the nature of I, concerning the internal and the external, which extend over the past, the future and the present, amounting to 108 wanderings of craving. Can Ajahn please explain this further? Well, 108 means there's a lot. There's a lot of craving around in our mind and in our conditioning, the conditioning processes of the mind. 108 can be a very auspicious number. It can also be a very unfortunate number, because it means there's a lot to deal with. There's a lot of work we have to do. There's a lot of mindfulness we need to deal with 108 different types of craving. And we say the wanderings of craving, that's the nature of craving, isn't it? Your mind wanders off into different objects and moods and emotions, and then gets lost and attached to them. So we wander off into greed or lust. We wander off into irritation, frustration. We wander off into sleepiness. We wander off into stubbornness. We wander off into fear. That's the nature of craving. It takes your mind away from the present moment, from the Dhamma, from the truth, into a world of falsity, fake, the opposite of truth, falseness. So again, I think it's from the Abhidhamma we get this way of calculating all the different kinds of craving. So we say internal, external. So internal we have 6 senses. So we have eyes, ears, nose, tongue, skin, touch, and then the mind. Then external ayatana, external sense bases, is the objects of the senses. So eyes have sights, sounds, taste, smell, touch, and mental objects. So that's 2 6s, that makes 12. But you can have, like you said, they can be internal, external, and then they can be in the past, the present, or the future. That's 3, so 3 times 12, 36. And then there's craving, as I mentioned earlier. Craving, Tanha, has 3 types. There's sensual craving, craving to have, to become, craving not to become, not to have. So there's 3 types of craving. So 36 times 3 is 108. You can also get 1,500 kinds of craving, but maybe we'll leave that for another day. Perhaps in summary, we just say there's a lot of craving there to be had. You know, you can see something and it gives rise to a form of desire. I want that, I like that, or I don't want that, I don't want anything to do with that. Craving arises through our sense contact with feeling, with perception. We get craving arise if we're not mindful. So the important thing is be mindful, very mindful, and keep up the insight meditation practice, and then even though craving arises, you can quickly cut it off and let it go. And eventually you'll get so tired of craving, it will stop. That's our aim. But 108 kinds of craving just remind you that the mind can wander off in 108 different directions. Last question. Luang Pu, could you please talk about Luang Pu Ginnery, please? So a change of pace from the Abhidhamma. Luang Pu Ginnery was one of Luang Pu Cha's teachers and a highly respected meditation master from northeast Thailand, but not that well known in his lifetime. He lived like 100 years ago. He was practicing. He died in the 1970s, just before I came to Thailand, so I didn't meet him. He's a disciple of Luang Pu Man, like so many of these forest monks, and is considered to have been enlightened. And he's well known, as I said, he wasn't that famous in his lifetime, because in those days there's no internet and means of communication. He lived a very simple, quiet life, but in the small circle of forest monks who knew him, his reputation was very good. He lived in Nakhon Phanom. I've been to his monastery a few times, in Nong Hi village, if I remember. Some of his relatives, I remember going to his monastery after he passed away. His niece, I think, is still a nun, was still a nun there, and she had very good meditation. So she was considered to be very attained, very wise, peaceful nun. So he was born into a farming family. He was a novice from about the age of 10. I think for most of his teenage years he was a novice monk, and he studied the scriptures, learned the basics of the monastic training. But like many novices, when he reached 19, just before he reached the age he could become a monk, he disrobed to go back to the lay life, maybe taste the lay life a bit. And he did get married, but he was unlucky. His wife died, I think, in childbirth, and then later the child died. So I think that probably brought him a lot of sadness and was one of the factors that brought him back into the robes. I think at the age of 25 he became a monk. Also, they say he wasn't that good at business. He tried to trade cattle and he was always losing money. So he said he just didn't have the vasana, the good karma to be successful in business. But then that can be a hidden bonus, a hidden blessing, because then you turn to the monastic life. If you're no good in business and your family die, very sad, you become a monk, and he became an arahant. So, if he had been good at business, maybe he wouldn't have become a monk, wouldn't have become an enlightened monk. But he did become a monk, and he very quickly went to find Luang Pu Man. But before he found Luang Pu Man, he found Luang Pu Tongrat. Luang Pu Tongrat was quite an old monk by the time Ajahn Ginari found him, and he was another of Ajahn Chah's teachers and a disciple of Ajahn Mun. Luang Pu Tongrat took him to see Ajahn Mun and was his kind of mentor in the early years, and as well as Luang Pu Mun being his teacher. It's funny, we were talking earlier about practicing with craving. I seem to remember from Ajahn Luang Pu Ginari's biography, the first teaching he received from Luang Pu Tongrat was to be aware of the danger of practicing with craving. And Luang Pu Tongrat said, one of my biggest obstacles was I was always meditating with craving, wanting results and very fixated on results, and so my mind never gathered together in samadhi until I abandoned that kind of craving. I just learned to let it go, see it and let it go. But they both went off to stay with Ajahn Mun until Ajahn Mun passed away, and then Ajahn Ginari went off, and he's well known for, actually before Ajahn Mun passed away, he already started. He was wandering in the forests of northeast Thailand, northern Thailand. This is particularly in the 1930s, so before the Second World War. And what a lot of the forest monks did in those days, before the Second World War, borders were not very well defined and you didn't need passports, so they would wander to Laos or into Burma and spend time in these other countries. And Luang Pu Ginari walked all the way to India. He had faith to walk to India, and he said had his best meditation at Kusinara, where the Buddha entered parinibbana and the Buddha was cremated. That was he said, his best spot for meditation and the most meaningful spot for him in his practice. He also was in Burma for many years, wandering in the forests, and he went to Shui Dagong Pagoda in Yangon and said that was also a really good place to meditate. Very powerful experiences there. Before he had gone wandering in the forests of Burma to India, he actually got his mother to ordain as a nun. He thought that what's the best way I can help my mother? His father had passed away, but his mother was alive and he wanted to help her, so he got her into the robes as a nun. And he also encouraged his niece to ordain as a nun, so there would be a younger friend for his mother, and they were in one forest monastery learning to meditate and practice. And while he was in Burma, he actually had a nimitta, a vision of his mother dying. So he walked all the way back to northeast Thailand, which is like many months of walking, to check on his mother, and he found she was sick, so then she died and he performed a cremation for her. And then he walked all the way back to Burma to carry on his practice there. As far as I remember, he walked barefoot as well. So he's walking all over Thailand, Burma, India, barefoot, living very simply, very ascetically. So he's known for his simple lifestyle, very few possessions, always staying in the forest in simple accommodation, in poor regions where the food probably was very simple. But that obviously suited his practice. And he said he practiced meditation, and he emphasized you've got to practice mindfulness in all postures. Meditation is not something you just do with your eyes closed, sitting down, cross-legged. You have to learn to be mindful in all postures and maintain your samadhi in all postures and investigate the Dhamma in all postures, because these mental defilements we've been talking about tonight, they can arise at any time, not just in your meditation. When your eyes are closed, sitting with your legs crossed, they'll arise at any time in any activity. So you've got to be constantly vigilant. And this was something he talked about a lot. Ajahn Chah went to stay with both Ajahn Tongrat and Ajahn Ginari several times. I think he got to hear about them as disciples of Ajahn Mun, and Ajahn Chah went to visit Ajahn Mun as well. But he spent time with these two teachers, and particularly Luang Pu Ginari, he seemed to have an affinity. He appreciated his wisdom. Luang Pu Ginari, they say, was a man of few words. He didn't give long explanations of Dhamma, long Dhamma talks. He gave brief instructions to the monks and give very sort of direct, to the point reflections when it was needed. So one of the times Ajahn Chah recounted, I think this is in the biography, Luang Pu Ginari, by the time Ajahn Chah was living with him, Luang Pu Ginari was more senior, and Ajahn Chah was practicing meditation many hours a day, sitting, walking meditation. He was very sincere and putting a lot of effort and energy into his meditation. But then he noticed Luang Pu Ginari didn't seem to do much meditation at all. He said he noticed Luang Pu Ginari might walk meditation for a few moments, for a few minutes, and then go away and do some job like making a broom or sewing some robes or do some job pottering around the monastery. Or he'd sit meditation for a few minutes and then he'd get up and do something else. So Ajahn Chah had a doubt in his mind. He said, Ajahn Ginari, they say, has very deep samadhi and is an enlightened teacher, but I never see him meditate. So have they got it wrong? You know, these people who praise him, have they got it wrong? And then one day Ajahn Ginari came over to Ajahn Chah and said, you know, just because a monk only takes a few steps on the meditation path, walking meditation, doesn't mean to say he's not in samadhi. And Ajahn Chah realized not only did Luang Pu Ginari have good samadhi, but he had psychic powers and understood what he was thinking. He was doubting about Luang Pu Ginari's, what he saw as lack of formal meditation. He wasn't sitting or walking much. And Luang Pu Ginari is saying you can maintain deep samadhi in any posture. So that was one thing Luang Pu Chah quoted. Another one was when Luang Pu Chah was preparing to go off on his own wandering in the forest. He was preparing robes. Luang Pu Ginari looked after Ajahn Chah, and in his young days he didn't have much support, so he needed a new set of robes. So Luang Pu Ginari provided him with cloth, and then Luang Pu Chah was sewing it. And sewing a set of robes takes many hours of work, and Luang Pu Chah was just going for it, sitting there sewing day and night. So he's hardly resting, and he's just sewing. And Luang Pu Ginari noticed this, seeing that it looked like Ajahn Chah was very kind of impatient and sort of obsessed with the sewing. So he came over and said, you're sewing a lot, you're not resting at all, you're just sewing. You know. Why is that? And Ajahn Chah said, well, so I can go off to this forest to do my meditation. And Ajahn Ginari said, well, after you've gone off to that forest to do your meditation, what are you going to do? He said, well, and then I'm going to go to another area and do some more meditation. And Ajahn Ginari asked again, so after you've been to that new area and done some meditation, what are you going to do? And Ajahn Chah said, well, then I'll go off to this other place and I'm going to do some meditation. And Ajahn Ginari just gave him this reflection that, you know, meditation isn't something you do in the future, and you do this job now so that then you can go off and do your meditation. Meditation is about present moment awareness. You do it right now, right here. And so if you're sewing robes, that's part of your meditation. But don't do things in a compulsive way, always planning for the future or putting your mind in the future, because then you miss the present moment. So that was something else Ajahn Chah got from Luang Pu Ginari. The last reflection I remember Ajahn Chah quoting was that before he did leave Luang Pu Ginari to go wandering a final time, I think he had talked with Luang Pu Ginari, and Luang Pu Ginari said, where are you going to go? And Luang Pu Chah said, well, I'm going to wander through the forest, but I'm going to head back to my home village. And Luang Pu Ginari agreed. He said, yeah, maybe it's a good time to settle down because you've been wandering in the forest for many years now. And it's quite hard. You know, you get ill, the conditions are tough, and that's not always the best for our physical health or for our meditation. So Luang Pu Ginari was agreeing with Luang Pu Chah that he should go back to his home village. he said, "Yep, you're ready to be a teacher, but just watch out for those Dhamma talks. Don't get too lost in teaching." That was his final reflection for Ajahn Chah. And after that, Ajahn Chah went back and began his own monastery, Wat Nong Bapong. So Luang Pu Ginari lived a very simple life in a very quiet monastery. He had a few nuns there, some of them were his relatives, there were a few monks with him. And he's just known to be a very quiet man, a few words, but very mindful and considered to be free from mental defilements. He lived until, not sure how old he was, maybe till he was about 75, 80 years old. Died in the 1970s, but before he died, Ajahn Chah used to send monks to help look after him in his old age, just to attend on him, nurse him in the last years of his life. And Ajahn Chah had great gratitude to Luang Pu Ginari as a teacher. And any time Luang Pu Ginari visited Ajahn Chah, even though Ajahn Chah himself was a teacher with many disciples, many students, when Ajahn Ginari came to visit him, Ajahn Chah would always be very humble, respectful. He'd get off his seat, he'd wash Luang Pu Ginari's feet, he'd receive his bag, put him down, set up his seat, do all the practices we call acharyawata, which is like attending on a senior monk. So the monks were always, Ajahn Chah's students were always impressed because they'd see their own teacher attending on another teacher. So this, these people say this is a sign of a lack of self, a lack of conceit, lack of pride. Some teachers maybe become attached to being a teacher and they have pride in their, even conceit, arrogance sometimes. Ajahn Chah, one of the ways people saw that he didn't have so much pride is because he was very humble with his teacher and he would serve him. Even when he was getting older, he'd do this. So they say it's very beautiful to see how Ajahn Chah served Luang Pu Ginari, his teacher. So we think for Ajahn Chah, Luang Pu Ginari was a very important monk, one of his important teachers. But there's not a lot of information about him from that era where there's not a lot of books, records, recordings. We've only got what other monks have handed down to us. So that was a few words on Luang Pu Ginari, one of the forest masters from northeast Thailand. I remember when I was a young monk, I went there, well not a young monk, but younger monk. I went to his monastery and as I said, his niece was there, she was a nun, she had very good meditation. Considered to have jhana and deep insight. I imagine she's passed away by now, otherwise I'd recommend people who want to meet a wise, compassionate, peaceful nun, go and see her. But I remember staying there and having very good meditation, very peaceful atmosphere. It was a very ordinary monastery, little forest monastery with simple buildings, not very large, but very peaceful atmosphere. And nearby is the monastery of another of Ajahn Luang Pu Ginari's disciples, was a monk called Luang Pu Uwan, who was a friend with Ajahn Chah. They both lived with Luang Pu Ginari for a while and they both went wandering in the forest together. Luang Pu Uwan, again, he's passed away now, but a very wise, peaceful monk with good samadhi, good psychic powers. I remember the day we went to see Luang Pu Uwan. We went from Luang Pu Ginari's monastery to Luang Pu Uwan's monastery. I was with Ajahn Anan and we were late for the meal. The meal was at 8 o'clock and for some reason we were running late. So normally they say Luang Pu Uwan would come out of his kuti and wait in the eating hall at 8 o'clock. He'd give a blessing and serve the food and they'd have their meal. And he had a number of monks living with him. But that morning they said he didn't come out of his kuti, the morning we were going. And we were about 45 minutes late. It was very embarrassing. I think we got lost because we didn't know the roads, and it's a very remote kind of part of Thailand. So we were late, and he just didn't come out of his kuti, even though in those days there was no phone or no way of communicating with them. So the monks were puzzled. They said, "Oh, why is Luang Pu not coming out of his kuti?" And then we arrived, and all the monks straight away put two and two together, and they said, Luang Pu must have known that this group of monks was on their way here, so he was waiting before the meal was served, out of compassion. But Luang Pu Uwan was a disciple of Luang Pu Ginri, and he had a great affinity with Ajahn Chah. I remember that time we went to see Luang Pu Uwan. We were asking him about Ajahn Chah and when they wandered in the forest together, and one of the last things he said was that when Luang Pu Chah was staying with Luang Pu Ginri, and around that time he was meditating so much, like he's putting in so many hours a day into his meditation. His mind was so bright and energized. He was very skinny, putting forth all this energy and effort in his practice. But they would walk on Bindabata into the village in the morning, and he said when he walked behind Ajahn Chah, because he was just slightly junior to Ajahn Chah, if I remember, he said he'd watched Ajahn Chah and he was very bright, energized from his practice, and he said he couldn't see Ajahn Chah's feet touch the ground. It looked like Ajahn Chah was floating. Maybe it was just a mirage or perception coming from the aura of brightness from Ajahn Chah's, enlightened mind, perhaps, I don't know. But he said he couldn't see Ajahn Chah's feet touch the ground when he walked behind him. It looked like he was just floating on the earth. That was more or less the last thing I heard from him before we left the monastery. So, a few recollections of teachers from the last century, quite a while ago now. But we'll leave you with those words tonight.